Okay, so why don't we begin then? Welcome everybody here. I'm very pleased, and I emphasize the very here, to have Fabrizia with us today. An old friend. I can't remember how long we've been together. A long, long time.
2002.
2002. She has a good memory. Let's see, currently you're the Director General of the Ministry of Finance, so you're the top tax person there. How many ministers have you gone through?
7.
7 ministers. Yeah, not bad, no? Not bad. No. Each minister must be very different. And how?
Each minister is very different. Each minister is very difficult.
Okay.
I can tell you. Having covered all of the constitutional spectrum, nearly all.
From left to right, yeah?
From to right, not to the extreme right yet.
Yes. Okay, well, that's a lot.
Each of them is very good.
And the other thing that you've done is that you played a very active role in the Committee on Fiscal Affairs. I think you're now the Deputy Chair of the Committee?
Yes.
Deputy Chair of the Committee, yeah. And then you chaired until recently the EU Code of Conduct Group.
Yes.
And at the same time, she has a family. Still have a family?
Yes, I still.
Yes. Yeah.
I still do.
So 7 ministers, 1 family, 3 jobs, and an active life outside of work as well, yeah? So it's great to have you here. I can't think of anybody who is better placed to talk about our topic today of basically tax competition, the new normal, than you, because you've gone through it all. I remember the times that we had with the G7, or what was then the G8, yeah? I remember the times with the Bush administration. We believe in tax competition, yes? Maybe that is coming back. So a lot of experiences that we've had together, I think, on this.
Well, I started, Jeff, with you with the 1998 report and its 4 criteria that turned into 2, into tax transparency and exchange of information. We suddenly forgot about
we didn't forget, it was a diplomatic omission, yeah? But in a sense, I think we've come back to that. In many ways, how many people have read the 1998 report on harmful tax competition? Put your hands up. Oh my God, it's a generation issue, isn't it? Yeah. It actually is. I think this is the basis of everything you see coming out of the OECD at the moment. Yeah. Yeah. Everything that's been done now was there. Yes, it was a great report.
Very far-sighted.
Very, report. Yeah. And that's why we couldn't get a consensus on it. You know, the report, 4 OECD countries, I shan't name them, Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, yeah, just said we're not signing on to this stuff, yeah. The US was on and then sort of changed its mind. The Treasury Secretary said, competition can't be harmful. Yeah. And I said to him, just like to get the full benefits of trade, we need rules that say what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. To get the full benefits of competition, we need rules of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable, yeah? He said, yes, Jeffrey, go back and change the project, yeah? So it was an interesting debate. The format is our usual format. We have the physical audience here. It's a bit special this time because for the people that are in the virtual audience, we actually have a meeting of our group on cooperative compliance. So we have 60 people, government, business, academics that are involved in that work. They're participating, at least I think most of them are. The food is free here, so that's a good indication that probably you will participate. And then a number of researchers from the Institute and some from private sector here in Austria. And then we have the virtual audience. I think Eva will correct me. The last count, we were about 20 countries, 45 people. So basically, this is a global audience. You know, the people from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe as well, yeah? So the structure will be that we'll go around 3 or 4 rounds of debates. I guarantee we won't get through them all, but we'll see how far we can. And we'll also bring the audience, I'll bring the audience in for questions at the end of each round. The virtual audience, you can send your questions in via, it's my email, Eva? Okay, you just look at the link and you can put your questions and then we'll try to answer those as well, yeah? Do you have any omissions, confessions that you need to say before we move?
We can start.
We can start. That's what I like. Yes, we can. I think it was Obama that said that, wasn't it? So the first question then really is about what are the new constraints that government face in competition for investment, for services, for activities? And in a sense, as you said, the 98 report, a landmark report, sort of tried to answer that question. by putting a lot of emphasis on transparency, on exchange of information, on if you had a lower nominal rate and you combined them with a lack of information, a lack of transparency, then you had a problem as well, yeah? What was interesting about the 98 report, it dealt both with harmful preferential regimes and tax havens, yeah? And at that time, it was very easy to identify a tax haven, yeah? Remember Somerset Maugham's definition? A shady place in sunny places? Yeah? No, sunny places for shady people, yeah? I think that, yeah? Yeah, that was the easy definition. And in 98 report, we actually did think about using that as a definition, but we decided maybe it wasn't the right one. So essentially, a tax haven was a place that lacked transparency and did not exchange information, had low, no nominal tax rates as well, yeah? It's much more difficult today to define a tax haven, yeah? And maybe that's something we can come to, yeah? So in a sense, what we've seen since then is the process has moved on. We've had the BEPS Action 5, yeah, which has extended it, particularly put a lot of emphasis on substance. We've had the work of the EU Code of Conduct, broadly compatible with the OECD work. And then we've had this forgotten institution, actually maybe forgotten already, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which also takes an interest in this issue of what is a subsidy, when is it harmful and when it's not, yeah? And I think for the researchers here, that's a fascinating topic, to look at the link between what's a harmful tax regime under the OECD guidelines, what's harmful in state aids, and what's harmful with the WTO, yeah? What's the linkage between them? Because there is a linkage, I think, yeah? But that's for the future, yeah? So, so with all those developments then, what's going to be the end game here? I mean, you were at the center of this debate at the OECD, you were at the center of the debate in the EU. Where are we going on tax competition? I like that answer, it's a great answer.
An easy question. Well, let me start, Jeffrey, by saying that it is true. I mean, we have tax competition is a long-standing issue in the international tax agenda for academics. We are in a university for politicians and for the international organizations. And in the recent years, globalization and the growing and the growing importance of intangibles, of intangible assets in the process of value creation have put increasing pressure on countries to compete for investment. You were asking me about what are the constraints that governments face. We have, in the last 20 years, if you look at the figures, the very good revenue statistics from the OECD, you will easily see that the statutory corporate income tax rates have steadily decreased by a significant amount. It's over 10%.
Because in fact, I mean, this is a really good. Typical corporation is facing a nominal corporate tax rate of half what they faced 50 years ago, yeah?
Yes.
I mean, you're not talking about a small, it's gone from 50 to something like 25, yeah? At the same time, the share of profits in GDP have increased, yeah?
Exactly.
So it's been Christmas the whole year round for multinationals, yes?
Well, I mean, this is what is called, is normally referred to as the corporate income tax rate, corporate income tax revenue puzzle. That is, well, it's not that difficult a puzzle indeed, but it's been, studied. There is a very nice paper by a colleague from the European Commission, Gaetan Nicodem, who actually analyzes the trend in rates and revenues to conclude that basically broadly, the fact that the corporate income tax revenue has not decreased can be explained in terms of both the broadening of the tax base, but also can also with the increasing share of the corporate sector in the total economy. Interesting is the fact that because the the time horizon that has been investigated is 20 years. And interestingly, in the last 10 years, it is observed that the space the support from for revenue, for the corporate income tax revenue, is coming from the increase in the corporate sector share rather than in the broader tax base. And this suggests that maybe the space for that is limited or is getting to the limit. This is certainly one constraint that government will face if they want to compete for attracting mobile tax bases, through, reduced rates. It is also true that normally what counts for driving investment location decisions is certainly the statutory rate, but it is more than that, the effective tax rate. And but still, the point that I want to make with reference to your question on the constraints that government may face is the fact that this game, here there can be an issue, in the near future there can be an issue of sustainability of tax competition. Sustainability in terms of not the sustainability of the tax system, but sustainability of the with respect to the contribution that tax policy gives to the economic policy in general, the funding that is needed for to continue to provide our public services, our public goods, and to finance our welfare state, to which we don't want to renounce, must be taken into account.
And I think, in a sense, I mean, in the OECD area, the corporate income tax accounts for about 8% of total taxes. Some countries as low as 2%, and it's generally been declining. In non-OECD countries, it can go anywhere from 15 to 50%, yeah? So this is a very important source of revenue. I think one of the other points you raise is the limits on the rate reductions, because reducing your rate of corporate income tax by 1% is pretty expensive, yeah, because it goes right across the board, which is why countries say, well, we maintain the rate, but we put in incentives. Yes? Whether we've come to the end of the road, the race to the bottom, I don't know, yeah. I still see countries beginning to reduce their corporate income taxes. As you say, I think because probably the percentage of GDP in profits is not going to increase as it has in the past. So in a sense, you would begin to see the corporate tax revenues reduce, both in absolute amounts and as a percentage of GDP, yeah?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's one thing, we should be very clear also about another point here, that policies aimed at attracting investment or at increasing the competitiveness of an economy are not just tax policies. Tax policies is one factor, but there are other factors that count as much. And this is the quality of infrastructure, the quality of services provided, the quality of the judicial system. And this actually brings me to another point. In the face of constraints that governments may face in the near future for, if not for attracting business, for not losing their business towards other jurisdictions, the one possible direction that should be undertaken is to focus on other aspects that do not have a direct impact on tax revenue. And a key factor, a crucial factor, is certainly to improve the quality of the tax system in terms of tax certainty. It is now, I think, very clear that multinational enterprises, big corporate businesses, do value that actually do operating cross-border, do value the tax certainty at least as much, if not more, than the tax burden that they have to pay. They, we had an interesting conference actually this year, in spring in Italy. We hosted a conference with with an original theme, the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy. And it is very clear from, and we had both, and we had at the table not only the big tech, but also big multinational enterprises operating in the ordinary economy. And it was very clear from their, the big tax division bosses that for them, paying taxes or paying more taxes is not that much an issue, or at least it's not an issue as much as it is to know that they can operate in different jurisdictions with a decent degree of tax certainty.
I think that's absolutely right. In a sense, the name of the game for a large multinational is that when you go into a jurisdiction, what you want is predictability, consistency, and fairness. You want to know if you earn 100 million, how much you're going to be paying in taxes. You want to know if you have a problem, you're going to get it resolved, which is why it brings us to the conference that we have today on cooperative compliance, because cooperative compliance is a very effective way of providing that certainty. But just stepping back, I mean, it's sort of an interesting thing of how important is tax in a factor of where you locate, yeah? Interesting debate for the UK coming up to where you are, because the first thing is that tax will never compensate for not getting the fundamentals right. What are the fundamentals? Political stability, infrastructure, well-educated population, cost factors, access to markets. Yes, you get those fundamentals right, tax is not going to be that important. Yeah? You don't get them right, well, maybe then you try to compensate by tax incentives, but then you get the wrong type of investment, the fly-by-night investment, yeah? And then you look at the way that decisions on location are taken in companies. Yes? I mean, typically, you'll have a board meeting, yeah? And the board will say, well, okay, look, which continent do we want to invest in, yeah? Latin America, yeah? At that point, the tax director's not even in, not even in the toilet next to the boardroom, yeah? He's out of it, all of it, yeah? So they take the decision, we're going into that continent. Then the next question is, which country, yeah? And even there, probably the tax the vice president doesn't get called into the very end, yeah? So the decision of which continent and which country probably is not that dependent on tax, yeah? Then you decide, having decided you're going to go into, say, Brazil. At that point, the tax director's there, because then you have to decide how you structure the investment, how you finance it, yeah? And that determines your ability to get funds out in a tax-efficient way, yeah? So the location decisions, I think, the influence of tax is overplayed, other than on the negative. I mean, I'll give you a good example. Russia, why in the 1990s was Russia getting so little investment, yeah? Because you couldn't tell, if you went into Russia and you earned 100 million, you couldn't tell how much tax you're going to pay, yeah? So tax can be a negative factor, but I think it's never going to be a factor that actually
leads you to decide the location of investment, but certainly it affects seriously the way you structure it, and as such is very, very important. This explains, the struggle in the last 20 years that we've had with analyzing tax regimes, all types of possible tax regimes enacted, in the whole world. This is what explains why the European Union has decided to embark, and this was when I was chairing the Code of Conduct, to embark on a process of listing, listing third countries on.
Only listing third countries, though, not the EU countries.
Not yet.
Not yet.
on the basis of their compliance with the tax good governance principle of the EU. That has been a very interesting, exercise.
It's been a very successful, because in a sense, many of the regimes you identified as harmful have been abolished or modified. Same for the OECD and the Harmful Tax Practices Group, yeah? Yeah. So in a sense, we've seen a lot of progress.
It's been a successful exercise, I think, also in terms of, because it has been possible to establish a constant dialogue and exchange with the OECD that is carrying out that exercise at the international level. And the two things have been mutually reinforcing. The EU started the exercise, borrowing a lot of the OECD ideas, principles, and practices, but then has plugged into that exercise elements that are typical of the EU context. The EU context is a very special context because the EU context is a context where it is the treaty of the European Union that, with the establishment of the four fundamental freedoms, sets the removal of trade and business location barriers as one of the founding principles of the internal market, and then has to then obviously in that context affecting the location of investment through tax policies unacceptable, but then it is then the issues of the competitiveness of the European Union with the rest of the world comes into the picture, and then you have to deal with that. And if you move into the external dimension, we moved into the external dimension simply, importing the exercise carried out at the OECD level and using the principles on which the code of conduct is based, but the code of conduct is being conceived for the internal market. Yeah. So without not caring necessarily...
sorry,
say.
No, but I think it would have been much more difficult for the EU to have advanced on the Code of Conduct Group unless the OECD work had been there, because you don't want your tax treatment to put you at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis countries outside of the EU, and one way of achieving that is by having the OECD have this sort of global initiative. Yeah.
True. But as I was saying, Jeffrey, there's been, for instance, at the OECD before, up until the time when this exercise of the Code of Conduct for the EU, the so-called EU list started, it was not possible in the Forum for Harmful Tax Practices to talk about low or zero taxation, Then, the discussion in Europe was possible because, the Code of Conduct has the zero or very low taxation as a gateway criterion, and the issue was there on the table. So that provided a push, to tackle that issue also in the context of the FHDP. We had a very interesting discussion when it came to the assessment of the manufacturing regimes, because manufacturing regimes have always been out of the,
the OECD was based on mobile factors of production and services. Huh?
Exactly. And there is a very clear reason. And instead, at the level of the EU, manufacturing regime are fully in scope of the European exercise. And the reason is simply linked to the four fundamental freedoms. As we found ourselves, confronted with manufacturing regimes in Africa or elsewhere in the world, and having to decide where they were harmful or not, it was not very clear at all. While it is very, very clear why you need that in the context of the internal market, it is not necessarily, it's no longer very clear when you move outside.
And in a sense, we're moving into a new ball game here because, under the BEPS Pillar 1C, where you're basically saying, Pillar 2, sorry, where you're establishing a minimum tax, effectively that could put a floor on the race to the bottom, yeah? And let's imagine that it's going to be, the effective tax rate is going to be 12.5%, yeah? Because that seems to be a number that our Irish colleagues seem to like, 12.5.
We've heard this number.
I mean, but don't forget, it's Ireland. Actually, Ireland's interesting because the nominal rate is 12.5. The effective rate is quite close to that, yeah? Whereas in other countries like France, there's a big gap between the nominal and the effective, yeah? So 12.5%, and if you're below that, then if you set that as the effective minimum tax rate for Pillar 2, yeah? On the one side, that definitely is putting a sort of a floor to the race to the bottom. On the other side, you know, it's going to be interesting to see how the developing countries react, because you're basically taking away their sovereign right to design their tax systems, huh? And it's quite interesting is that the Americans are the ones that are pushing that idea, and yet way back, you know, with the Bush administration, it was the Americans who said, no, we've got to respect fiscal sovereignty, yeah? So fiscal sovereignty is in the eyes of the beholder, yeah?
Well, it's true. It's, you know, I mean, in this phase, in which, you know, tax competition is still there, you know, despite all these exercises and all the analysis and all the listing and the recommendation, tax competition is still there. Tax competition is also taking new forms, no? In some sense, and the pillar 2 of the unified approach that is currently in discussion at the OECD, as in the context of a general reform of the international taxation for multinationals, can be a useful response. Mind you, the Pillar 2 was not conceived for responding to tax competition and to actually put a floor to the race to the bottom that we are witnessing, and we could continue to witness with some problem. But Pillar 2 was conceived as the ultimate answer to another issue of competition. That is, you know, is tax competition that has spillover effects on the base through profit shifting. So that was, you know, there was a simple thing. I mean, we have carried out, completed the BEPS project. The BEPS project has, you know, does represent a progress, but still the differences in tax systems and in tax rates still leave open possibilities for profit shifting. That the minimum effective taxation, establishing across the world a minimum effective level of effective taxation, wants to be a response to that. But in fact, it would be, you know,
this is quite remarkable here, yeah? We have a concept that's pushed by the United States of a global minimum tax. I mean, that's, you know, you just think of the position of the US over the years, that is quite a big change, yeah? And it's going to be interesting to see whether people buy into that or not. The other thing I think that's happened, you know, a lot of emphasis is put on substances. I mean, that's the way you get out of a lot of these being categorized as harmful, the substance behind your regime, yeah? And the difficulty is that sometimes it's not easy to measure substances. And secondly, you know, take with IP boxes, yes? That's the ultimate, yeah? I call them weapons of mass destruction, yeah? Because they, you know, just think of it, you know, something like 80% of the wealth of the top 500 corporations are in intangibles, yes? Intangibles depend on research and development. So, you know, what do? You develop your intangible in a high tax country, you get the deductions at a high rate, and then just when you may, you know, let's say bald men, you know, that's an irrelevant one. I'm not looking at you particularly, looking at myself, yeah? So you develop, you know, you have 4 or 5 remedies for this, yes? You put a massive investment in it, you come into the end, you say, it's B that's going to be the one, yeah? That's where I'm going to make my money. So you move then the patent from there into an IP box in the UK, for example, yeah? And it's very easy to do that. Now you have to have substance. What does substance mean with technology, yeah? Does it mean having 10 researchers that move from Bahamas, that's not a good example, that moved from South Africa to London, you know, or to Italy, yeah. So so in a sense, I think what has happened is that, yes, we've more or less resolved the issue of harmful competition with the tax base, yeah, but we're now getting down to competition for the substantive activities, yeah. And I think the countries that are going to benefit most from this are going to be countries like the Netherlands and Ireland and others, yeah. So it's an interesting dynamic that we've got here.
But if you had this minimum effective taxation established on a per jurisdiction basis, you could actually be relieved. I mean, the problem would still, I mean, the thing would still be there. You could be a little bit, you know, relieved into this. And this is the reason why I think it would be a really important development. I think it's a very difficult one. There are, you know, talking about a minimum effective rate of tax, you know, leads you to then, you know, think about how do you actually impose it, and the way in which you ensure that every multinational business pays at least a certain minimum amount of tax in each jurisdiction where it operates is not indifferent in terms also of its redistributive effects, because I mean, you know, if you do it through an income inclusion rule, then you will basically ensure, you know, the revenue to the country of residence of the multinationals that are going to be typically, you know, rich, developed economies. If you do it through the undertaxed payment rule, then that would actually be more liked by the developing countries, because that would, you know, allow them to keep a little bit of revenue. So, you know, I mean, there is also here a distributional issue that is part of the sustainability problem of the curve of the global corporate tax.
And I think that's a key factor, because countries have to feel that they're getting a fair share,
Exactly.
And if they feel they're not getting a share fair, then the system itself is not going to be stable. Why don't we see if there's any questions? I don't want long statements, but, you know, precise questions from the audience. We've got a micro here as well. You have a micro. Any questions? Comments? I can't believe it. I know you're all cooperative compliance people, but that doesn't mean you have to be silent. Oh, there's a question here. Name?
Bob van der Made from PwC. I was wondering if you can say anything about the position of the US and China in this whole setup, coming to a global consensus, and how important they are.
They're important. You.
Me?
No, well, I mean, I'm important. They're very important. Well, I can.
So not only the US, but also
China. You picked.
I'll begin, and you can correct me. I think we are working towards a situation where, in the tax area, the interests of China and the United States are aligning. Particularly in the digital. Because you think of all the debates so far is focused on Facebooks and Googles. What about Alibaba, Tencent, JD? So I think, you know, China, in the current debate at the OECD, China and the US, I think, have very similar objectives to make sure that our digital companies are not discriminated against. So it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic works out. On the details, it varies. I don't know whether, whether China and the US would agree on everything, but broadly, I think they have similar interests.
I think this is, it is so broadly. It can be, you know, still, you know, there are, you know, the implications of this discussion when there's, you know, this global solutions, you know, get closer to the, you know, to a concrete design, can certainly, you know, lead, you know, these two major players to have different positions, but certainly,
well, Chinese glass?
I mean, the discussion on minimum effective taxation, you know, the United States like that discussion because basically, as Jeff said, is a development of their own tax reform. And I think that what they will want to achieve in the end is what they always want to achieve, is that the rest of the world does what the United States is.
I mean, that's always the case. I mean, the US, I mean, if you think about it, they were always initiators of new ideas in the tax world, whether it's the arm's length principle or whatever, yeah? And then they always use the OECD to take those ideas out to others. And that's fine. Yeah, that's the way you get globally consistent rules. But just coming back to the Chinese one, I think one of the challenges is going to be, you know, China uses quite extensively tax incentives and special economic zones. And if you put it at this 12.5% effective rate, I think a lot of Chinese regimes will be below that. And the other thing is, to me, it doesn't make sense to say a country is below that. Because, you know, you then, it's like oranges and apples you're putting together. I think you have to look at sectors and regimes and say, in that particular area, you know, your effective tax rate is lower, rather than say that Italy has an effective tax, because it doesn't make sense.
Well, we see, you know, I mean, you know, the discussion at the moment, you know, is completely open, you know, and, you know, one possible landing of the discussion is, you know, where do you know, what the United States have done with their guilty, that is, you know, basically it's not a minimum, is a minimum level on the taxation of foreign income, or the U.S. income, you know, that is placed abroad. And it's not a minimum effective taxation of the U.S. businesses, regardless of whether they operate. You know, so where we will end up, you know, and is going to be seen. I suspect that you know, the United States will want the rest of the world to go, you know, where they've already gone. which you know. At times has been a lot helpful for the rest of the world. And what I have in mind here is that is another aspect of competition, of course, of tax competition, is our struggle for transparency. We would have never got where we have got without the crisis and without FATCA. And
it's not fat cats, it's FATCA, yeah?
And I remember very well a meeting called by Jeffrey in Paris in an afternoon at the ministry before the G8, where the end of bank secrecy was finally declared. And but that, you know, has turned into a real concrete change in the dynamic of competition among the global dynamic of competition, with the United States imposing unilaterally the willingness of obtaining all the information on the financial accounts of their citizens. Without that, we would not be where we are. Now, one can find this...
so the US is really a force for good.
Irritating or not, but I mean, this is a reality.
I agree, complete reality. And that brings us quite nicely to the second round, because I mean, up to now, we've primarily been talking about competition, you know, for investment made by companies. But there's also this issue of high net worth individuals. Now, in the past, you could compete, you know, by means of having strict bank secrecy. That's gone. But what you see is a lot of countries are putting in special regimes for these high net worth individuals, including Italy, as a way of attracting, because, you know, behind every company is an individual, And even if you have you know, an excessively hard tax regime, that individual say, I'm not going to locate my company there, I'm going to go elsewhere, So I think this whole issue of how do you see these type of regimes? Do we actually need a code of conduct for the way that countries compete by means of special regimes? I think, you know, the non-dom regimes, I mean, people think the non-dom regime is just in the UK. It's not. There's about 18 or 19 countries that have non-dom regimes, or the regimes that are put in, you know, the golden passports, There's a whole set of things. So is this the new era for competition?
Well, I mean, it certainly is a phenomenon we are observing, but this phenomenon should be read and analyzed in the context of the end of the bank secrecy, I think. So it's when countries have switched from competition for attracting, financial capitals to competition for attracting income of foreign high net worth, income tax base for foreign high net worth individuals. And, we've seen all these regimes, residence by investment, citizenship by investment, golden visas and things like that. And while there may be, more than legitimate reasons for choosing to enter or to apply for one of these regimes. We were having a discussion 5 minutes ago with Paolo that I don't see anymore. Is an Italian, is extremely bright Italian.
It's a pity he's left with all these compliments. It's a pity he's left the room. But, maybe just too modest.
He was telling. We were talking about the recent UK elections, and he was telling us the number of requests that he had received from UK residents to actually apply for this. For the Italian non-dom regime, that is actually a residence by investment regime, conditional on, not conditional, worried for the fact that Corbyn could win the elections, and all these people all these clients, potential clients, have disappeared once.
He's a very unhappy man. Now he's just lost 100.
This is a very legitimate reason, that you want to apply for that. I mean, you are in a place where you are carrying out your business. There is a phase of significant political uncertainty. You may well decide to do that. Okay, but. You can also, but obviously, I mean, these regimes are very open to abuses and misuses. And the abuse is not only depriving the state of residence of the person that is applying for you from its fair share of tax, but the misuse can also be to use these regimes, for instance, to circumvent the common reporting standard, the CRS, and so creating loopholes in the in the transparent network of exchanges that we have created after 2008, and these regimes have to be looked at carefully. Do
you think, in fact, then that maybe the time has come where the EU, maybe even the OECD, should actually be launching work in this area?
Well, certainly there is. There is certainly the need, at least in my view, and as I'm expressing my personal, feeling to rethink of the mandate of the code of conduct and the.
Because when we created the harmful tax, what was the harmful tax competition group, now harmful tax practice group, the OECD, we had a big debate what should be the coverage, yeah? And the decision was taken no.
Exactly, and the same,
and the same in the EU. Yeah.
It may be, it certainly will come, since we are again in a phase in which we should rethink of what the how the FHTP and the Code of Conduct should evolve in somehow. Certainly the issue will come back again. Now, it is an issue that, that the problem is that regimes are harmful if they don't contain the appropriate safeguards. And once you have clear that these regimes can be misused, you should still allow people that want to enter into these schemes for legitimate reasons to do it, but you should protect both the integrity of the CRS and you should avoid, unfair competition between these things. And safeguards would be set in terms of, commitment to spontaneous exchange of information on, with the tax authorities of the country from which the person applying for this regime is coming. Other safeguards could come in terms of, the commitment to check, to have, to provide for and to check the conditions for for residents related to the physical presence of these people, because then as they are normally set out in the international standards. So with these things, these regimes could be looked at with a more benevolent eye.
But that's not much different in the sense, what you're saying is there's a potential for misuse. That's exactly the same with tax incentives for corporations. Whenever you put a special regime in, there are always planners that will actually design around that regime, to achieve purpose. But one thing I think that may change the dynamic here is this, the development, what I call the digital nomads, yes? These very small individuals that have startups, yes, that will be looking for an attractive environment where to go. Why is it, for example, that the biggest center for blockchain in Europe is in Zug? Now, I know the cows are great there, yeah, and the mountain air is fresh, but tax is a big factor as well, yeah? And I think you'll see more and more countries, in fact, trying to put in regimes that target these digital digital nomads, because they are very mobile and they'll move, in fact, in part to response to taxes. Huh? That's an interesting debate. Why don't we move on to the third part, which is really about what are the new norms for tax competition? And we began to touch on that in the first round a little bit. Because if countries are now, and don't forget, we are talking about countries. As countries design their systems, business take advantage of them, yeah? And you can't criticize business for doing that. So as countries become more constrained in the use of tax incentives, in the use of preferential regimes, even perhaps in the use of lowering their corporate tax rate, yeah? How are countries going to compete? What's going to be the new form of competition? Because as long as you have taxes, there's always going to be tax competition. So what will be the new forms of competition that you see coming up?
Well, I also think that the response to this is what we have started to hint at before. And I think that it is in the quality of the tax system. Yeah. And the quality of the tax system, governments should start thinking in terms of how well they can implement the tax rules and enforce them, and how well it means how easily and with what degree of tax certainty. So certainly, clear and simple legislation is important. Consistent implementation is key, but also the appropriate use of all the advancements in the IT, in information technology, at the disposal of the taxpayers is for improving the services provided to taxpayers is very, very important. Together with that, an important role is played by the administrative measures, and here, we start from with our traditional advanced rulings, advanced APAs, to include also the cooperative compliance. Yeah. And I should say, based on our experience, this I think is starting this thing. We have started a pilot thing on ICAP, the International Compliance Assurance Program, that is working very well. And all these things will not only, by getting the taxpayer close to the tax administration, provide with tax certainty, and I think allow the tax authorities to keep their taxpayers.
So it's happy taxpayers, basically. Yeah.
Exactly.
Any questions on this part? No comments? Oh. There was one question from the audience, from the virtual audiences. As we move in and we put in these minimum taxes in place, doesn't this then trigger more pressure to have competitive measures outside of the tax system, yeah? Because, we focus very much on the corporate income tax, but, countries use their VAT systems, yes? countries use taxes on land and buildings. I mean, in the US, in the States, that's, you come and invest in my state, the land is free, I'll build you a factory, and maybe I'll even chuck in a school to train your workers as well, yeah? So won't we actually, aren't we like sort of squeezing a balloon here? We get out the tax part of the competition, but the competition goes into other areas.
I think that will be unavoidable.
And is that a good thing or a bad thing? What people think? So you move from tax competition to non-tax. What is non-tax competition? It's where you provide cash subsidies, where you actually provide facilities to companies that come into you, where you train people.
Better regulation.
Yeah, where you actually give them a low payroll tax. Yeah, France. Or you design your VAT so they provide. I mean, I mean, it's a very complex area. You can't just look at one tax. Yeah. In fact, you have to look at the tax benefit regulation system right throughout.
So yeah? It's the whole tax benefit system that can come into, you know, and well, you know, if it is an important issue, because it is true that there are, you know, many regimes that, as you, Jeffrey, were saying before, we were talking about the Chinese one, many regimes have been actually put in place for to sustain the competitiveness of the economy, not for you know, tax competition. And these regimes may be caught into the, or maybe not. You know, you could actually work out ways for taking that into account, for actually allowing still countries to basically craft their, you know, economic policy, also using using taxes and taxes on business. So, you know, something, but certainly, I mean, and if there will be, if one day, you know, there will be this
a world tax organization, that's what we want. Yeah? God, think how many of us will be out of a job then, yeah?
Implemented consistently all throughout the world, there is certainly be, you know, the competition will occur through through other channels.
I mean, as long as you have taxes, you're going to have tax competition. And if you look at the way some countries use their VAT systems, yes, to attract particularly service activities, yes? I mean, including in Europe until recently, yeah? So it's clear, you know, tax competition, it's not just the corporate tax, it covers a whole range of taxes. But I think the argument in saying, well, if we squeeze the tax competition out, we'll get non-tax competition, perhaps that's okay, because if you're given a grant or you're given a benefit, it's much more transparent and there's much less opportunities, I think, to misuse the system. So in one way, maybe it's not a bad thing if I'm beginning to replace tax competition by non-tax competition.
Yes, I mean, well, I mean, you know, it is it's a difficult discussion. If I think of the domestic discussion, when I mean, for reasons not of no, for reasons of actually designing policies that are you know, growth friendly, or that can help the economy in going through this difficult phase. That in Italy has been the case for the last, I don't know, many years, always. For instance, there is always a debate between would you use a tax incentive, would you use a subsidy instead, and the preference normally goes to tax incentive for the fact that they are, you know, self-managed by the tax.
Self-managed and not that transparent as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because, you know, if you think of what happens if you give a tax subsidy, basically your tax revenues go down. Most people like that, and your expenditure doesn't go up.
Exactly.
So you get all the political benefits of having provided a goodie, but without another cost. And I think that raises the issue of you know, how should countries go about deciding on these incentives? Yes? You know, whether via the tax system or the non-tax. And in a sense, I mean, the first thing is, what's your objective? What's your target? Yeah. Having decided that, then you would ask, what's the best way to achieve that target? Yeah. or rather the second question is, how much money are we prepared to throw at that problem, yeah? So first the objective, then how much money you put in it, then what's the best way to achieve it? By means of taxes, by means of subsidies, by means of regulations, yes? And then the fourth thing, which countries rarely ask, is how do we monitor that we're actually getting value for money, yeah? And most countries don't go through those four stages, but they need to. Yeah. Because that's the way you get around, and particularly having the reporting requirements, the engagement of Parliament, reporting the tax expenditure reports, because that's the way you can actually figure out then, are these incentives working or not, yeah?
Yeah. This is what we, well, I mean, we try to go through this, you know, to follow this list of issues that you have to tackle before designing a policy. We also have a system for a regular system for the ex-post analysis of the effectiveness of the incentives, the tax incentives. That is, in the end, is not necessarily not enough. It's not always, you know, enough to, you know, to push the political decision in the right directions, But I mean, certainly all the things are there, and I should say that all the work that we do at the OECD, different, you know, working groups and things is very, very important. Has been very, very important, you know, in time for, you know, improving the quality of the technical work that the tax administration does. But again, you know, then you can end up with, you know, with wanting to adjust the composition of your public accounts, yes. And forget about you know, all the replies that you're given to the other questions. But certainly it is an interesting question that to which one can only answer with the fact that if there will be you know, some sort of break on the competition through tax rates or tax you know, regimes providing a low effective tax rate, we will need to monitor how you know, that thing will transfer to other tools of the.
And in a sense, I think that's the next agenda, both for the EU and the OECD. That monitoring. I mean, there was a question from the virtual audience that will take us back to the whole question of the EU Code of Conduct and the listing process. Yes, I mean that's been a very difficult process. How do you see that developing now? The actual question is, when are you going to list the United States? But I didn't think I would put that to you. Yeah.
How nice.
No, this was a question. It was this.
Well, I mean that work will continue, I think, for the moment with the you know, a geographical expansion of the scope, but I'm sure that with the new commission, the issue of you know, revising the mandate, and in the context of that also, you know, I mean, you know, now the exercise is basically the monitoring of the commitment taken by the countries that have been found not to be in line with the EU tax good governance principle, and that have committed to align themselves. So is a technique, is an important work, is a technical work, is a work of dialogue with this jurisdiction. This is a very important dimension. I think that these exercises that are perceived from the outside world as, you know, aggressive, and from you know, the OECD, the group of the rich countries, or the EU against the rest of the world, are exercises that are contributing to creating the knowledge and the understanding, you know, of that is needed, that is crucially needed in our globalized world. And so now the monitoring, will go on, and but the real issue is whether one should move, for instance, should change a little bit the perspective of this exercise. These exercises are focused on single specific tax regimes, and they analyze each tax regime against, each of the criteria that have been, that are relevant for the specific exercise you're carrying out. Possibly, and also more consistently with this new this new movement towards the minimum effective taxation, we would need to look at the complexity of a tax system, and before, saying that one needs, because before asking others to change, to amend regimes or schemes.
I think that's particularly difficult for some of the offshore jurisdictions, where it's hard to imagine how they would have substance behind some of these regimes. So, but again, that comes back to how you define substance. I mean, a last question, and this one you may want to not answer, but, we have an Italian commissioner now in charge of tax, yeah? Hooray! But if you were asked by him, well, Fabrizia, tell me, what should be my 3 main priorities over the next 4 years? What would they be in tax? You can say no.
I better not do that, but I mean, I would, here there are, the unanswered. I would ask him, please, let's figure out a way of, either concluding this file on the CCCTB.
The CCCCCCCCCB.
Or forget it. Try, but, and,
But they can't drop any more C's, yes?
No, they can't. They would, I mean, I think these are the issues. I mean, the issues are, the, revision of the mandate of the Code of Conduct. How and in how and in which way, this, I mean, can this discussion at the EU level on the corporate taxation be, reconciled with what's happening at the international level? Does it, make sense?
But wouldn't it help? Because in a sense, I mean, this is to me, how many, 14 years, 17 years? I mean, the technical issues are all, and it's all now political, yeah? But maybe if the OECD gets this agreement on a minimum effective tax rate, that could help, because one of the fears of countries like Ireland is as soon as you've got a common tax base, you then see there's a real difference between a 35% nominal rate and a 12.5% nominal rate, yeah? If they know, in fact, there's going to be a minimum rate there, and it happens to be 12.5%, maybe that could help a little bit the debate.
Yes, that could help, but also, the minimum rate could also help the debate, because another, this was the concern of Ireland, but another concern for other countries that are particularly keen on actually collecting the revenue for corporate taxes was the fact that in the last version, the EU corporate tax, provides for incentives for businesses, provides for the AGI thing, for the super amortization things, and that was not acceptable. I mean, they were included in the design of the new corporate tax as options. So what somebody was not happy with was the fact that depending on how do you exercise the option, the revenue can change. But again, also the idea of the minimum tax could help also to ease that things. But then one should answer more fundamental question: would that still make sense if?
I think you see that's the key thing, because in a sense, if you're a commissioner of the EU, you have to have. I mean, my first thing is I would think, what's my legacy? What legacy am I going to leave behind in 4 years? Yes, and what are the criteria that I will judge any tax proposal that comes in front of me? Yeah, first criteria, and this is just purely personal, yeah, I would say, is this tax proposal, is it going to help us move towards a more effective single market? Yeah, if yes, a plus. Secondly, is it going to make the EU more or less competitive versus third countries? If yes, That's a plus. And then the third thing is it going to do something to deal with this tax populism that we see, where people are concerned about growing inequalities, and perhaps tax can do something? And if the answer is yes, so if you get 3 yeses, then I say, yes, this is something we're going to be pushing for, yeah? But you've got to have some criteria by which you judge whether or not you're going to push certain tax measures. Yeah.
We will see whether the fact that the UK will no longer be at the table will make things easier in tax issues, because one of the tasks that has been assigned to the new commissioner is also to explore how and which way qualified majority voting can help progress in can help the decision in taxation to be taken.
You were at the 10th anniversary of the Global Forum with me, yeah? And we had on the you had Moscovici, the commissioner, and you had the finance minister of Luxembourg, yeah? And you remember Moscovici says we should go for qualified majority, and the commissioner and the president said no. His body language was, I mean, his head was falling off, yeah. But I think it's a misconception to think that once we've got rid of the United Kingdom, that things are going to be hunky-dunky, yeah? Because a lot of countries, my darling, were lying behind, hiding behind the UK, yeah?
I agree with
now
you.
Suddenly they're going to have to come out of the woodwork, yeah? And so it may
with
actually be more difficult rather than less difficult. I see Eva's looking at me because we're going over our time.
Okay. So,
I'll take one question from the audience. Yes? The name, number.
My name is Muhammad Farooq. I am from Pakistan, Senior Manager Tax EY, Pakistan. My question is regarding the double tax treaty executed between Italy and Pakistan. The agreement was executed in 1984, and till to date there is no any amendment therein. As a tax consultant, when any entity of Italy requested me to give the advice on any transaction regarding the double tax treaty, we always facing a problem in the tax authorities of the Pakistan. Is your country doing any further amendment on that double tax treaty or not?
I'll stop you there. You can have that discussion
bilaterally.
Otherwise you won't be interested. Okay, and a very last question. Not an Italian question, please. No.
Okay. Italy is one of the richest countries in the world, so my question would be if you could contribute more to decrease the poverty in the world. I think we are in the year almost 2020, and we have still children in Africa who are dying without having the basic vaccinations and so on. And you are one of the richest countries in the world, and so that's the question. Thank you.
Well, as I said before, I mean, I think that one of the we are in a phase in which we are rethinking the policies for taxing multinational, and one of the dimensions of this thinking is also the redistributive effects of that. That doesn't come, to the, it's not that evident, but it is there. So, and I think that one of the a remarkable result of the evolution of the discussion in the context of international organization is the fact, that are standard setter like the OECD is the fact that by now at the table the discussion between countries that have been have always had divergent views, but I mean they had in common the level of development and the level of wealth of the population. Now, I mean, we are sitting, in every decision we take with all, in the context of this new inclusive framework that is made up of 139 countries. I think this will change. This will make a change in the policies for fighting poverty, the poverty that partly is, and then partly is also the result of the globalization.
I mean, and that's why it's proving so difficult to get a consensus at the OECD. Under the BEPS project was you win, I win, because it was all about better compliance. Under the new part of the project, it's you win, I lose. Yeah, and the fact that they have to do impact assessments, so the figures are going to be on the table. Yeah, and there are going to be losers and there's going to be winners. I think for developing countries, The average developing country probably is not going to be much affected. Some of the larger countries may gain, yeah? But again, a lot depends on the detail. I think on the broader issues you raise of, what's the role of tax in reducing inequality? I think there is a role there. I mean, clearly in the longer term, it's all about education, social provisions, yes? But I think tax has the capacity, if there's the political will, to actually reduce the incomes at the high end of the income scale. You can see the debate that's going on now in the United States on wealth taxes. You can argue whether that's a good thing or not, but I think one thing that you will see over the next 5 years is a new interest in inheritance taxes, a new interest in looking at capital gains taxes, more emphasis on offshore compliance, because that's a very effective way of reducing inequalities, and more emphasis on taxing the things that rich people spend. Yeah? So I think we'll see over the next 5 years countries actually focusing quite a lot on how do they use the tax system to reduce some of these inequalities.
I tend to say, from a domestic perspective, I tend to say that people should always be very careful when, because taxes do not naturally immediately get to the poor people, to the poor part of or to the lowest part of the income distribution of taxpayers. So when one designs policies, and it is, one should be honest with respect to that, because poor people don't pay taxes. So, I mean, very poor, the very poor ones. But one point, if you think poverty in an international dimension, then you should, then I think the tax policy in general can do many things, and the tax community is doing many things. I mean, all the projects, the projects that we're doing with, that involve the technical support, technical assistance to government, say to African governments and things, are very, very important, because the most important things and the most effective way on, for fighting poverty is to mobilize their resources, and we're doing a lot, in that direction. There is also this new, sort of, dialogue. I mean, this new engagement, all around the table for discussion on tax policies, and in due course this will produce its effect.
That's quite a nice way to finish this, because I think what I take away from the last remark, if you want to avoid conflict in the tax area, you need to talk. Yeah. Talk, and talk. Whether you're talking with your counterparts in other tax administrations, or you're having a dialogue with policymakers, or you're having a dialogue with businesses, talk is the best way of minimizing disputes. It doesn't sound very exciting, but it's actually very effective. Yeah. So thank you very much. It's been a great. I know you have a busy schedule, so I really appreciate taking the time. And thank the audience. You've been quite a quiet audience. But I suppose that's because you exhausted yourself this morning, or you're saving yourself for this afternoon's discussion, yeah? I'd like to thank the virtual audience, and I'm sorry I couldn't take all the questions that came in, but I took the two most interesting ones, I think. Eva, you did a usual nice job setting this up. Should give her a clap. She obviously does a great job. The technicians that got to set the whole thing up, yes. The only thing I want to think about, I see all these photographs on the wall here. Where's mine? Okay, with that, and just so that next year we expect to have at least 4 fireside chats. We're still planning to have one with Chip Harper, who is the U.S. Treasury, the lead person in the OECD for the U.S. Mick Keane from the IMF, that would be a great one. Dmitry Gerov from Estonia, who he lives and sleeps blockchain and digital, yes, so he'll be a great one. And then I hope we're going to have Akesh Ranjay from India, yeah, who has just retired from the Revenue Service. So we'll have at least 4 of the fireside. Akhilesh, yeah, he'd be great. Because he's now retired, so he can be a little bit more open. I like that. We have to come back when you retire. After another 7 ministers, 14 ministers, and you should call it time then, yeah? So watch the space. We'll put out the dates. And again, thank you very much for being such a patient audience. Thank you.
Thank you.